Sleepwalking into terror. Clara's fight against an ancient curse. Unbelievable truth revealed. Chapter 1. In the Dead of Night. Clara woke with a start, the bitter chill of the air biting at her skin. She was lying on damp grass, her body stiff from the cold, and a thick layer of fog clung to the ground around her. Her breathing was uneven, and her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to make sense of her surroundings. The world around her was quiet, unnervingly so, with only the distant rustling of leaves breaking the silence. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her palms damp and covered in dirt, her fingers trembling slightly. She blinked, looking around. The park was unfamiliar. Its narrow paths twisted through towering trees, and abandoned playground equipment loomed in the shadows. Clara's mind raced, trying to piece together how she had ended up here, alone in the dead of night. Her last memory was of falling asleep in her own bed. Now, her shoes were caked in mud, her clothes disheveled, as if she had been wandering for hours. But how? Why? She shuddered as a strange sense of displacement settled over her. The realization that she had no recollection of how she got here gnawed at her, an eerie unease bubbling just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The park felt too quiet, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. She glanced at her phone. Dead battery. Of course. The sinking feeling in her chest deepened as she slowly stood, wiping her hands on her jeans, though it did little to remove the dirt. She needed to go home. Needed to understand what was happening. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she staggered toward the streetlights in the distance, hoping to find her way out of this desolate place. Clara's footsteps echoed in the quiet suburban streets as she neared home. The house loomed in the distance, its dark windows reflecting the stillness of the night. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly as she unlocked the door and slipped inside, grateful for the warmth and familiarity of her home. But the relief was short-lived. Something was off. The house felt wrong, like a place she didn't quite belong anymore. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and her skin prickled as she stepped further in. The thought clawed at her mind. How did I get to the park? It was as though her body had moved without her knowledge, guided by something beyond her control. Her husband, Sam, stirred from the couch as she entered. Clara? His voice was groggy, still heavy with sleep. He blinked, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. What are you doing? It's the middle of the night. I don't know, she stammered, trying to piece her words together, still shaken by her disorientation. I woke up in the park. I don't know how I got there. Sam frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. The park? Clara, you've been here the whole time. I just checked on you an hour ago. You were sound asleep. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. No, she whispered. I woke up there, outside. My clothes are filthy. I don't. She stopped herself, glancing down at the dirt smeared across her jeans and shoes. It was undeniable proof of where she had been. Sam stood and walked toward her, his brow furrowed. Are you sure? You were right here in bed, Clara. I checked. I'm telling you, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. I woke up outside at the edge of town. I don't know how I got there, but I did. For a moment, Sam just stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He finally sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe you were sleepwalking? I don't know. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Clara shook her head. I've never sleepwalked before in my life. Why now? Sam shrugged, his uncertainty clear. Stress, maybe. You've been working long hours lately. Clara didn't respond. The idea that she had been sleepwalking seemed absurd, but she had no other explanation. Something about the park felt wrong, like she had been pulled there, lured by something she couldn't quite remember. She felt like a puppet whose strings had been yanked without her consent, and that terrified her. The next day, the unease lingered, gnawing at her from the inside. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened wasn't as simple as sleepwalking. It felt deliberate, like she had been guided to that place, but by what? Or by whom? That night she lay in bed, eyes wide open, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't risk it happening again. What if she wandered somewhere even more dangerous? What if she didn't come back? The morning came with no answers. Exhausted and on edge, Clara decided she couldn't let the incident pass without looking into it further. She needed help, professional help. The small office of Dr. Elizabeth Clarke was tucked away in the quiet part of town. Clara had found her name after searching for specialists in sleep disorders, hoping to get some clarity on what had happened. Dr. Clarke had a reputation for dealing with the strangest of cases that others couldn't quite explain. The waiting room was sterile and cold, the fluorescent lights humming softly. Clara sat, her leg bouncing nervously, as she replayed the events of the previous night over and over in her mind. The images from her dreams were blurry, fragmented but unsettling. She could almost remember shapes in the dark, whispers just out of reach. "Clara?" A voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up. Dr. Clarke stood in the doorway, her face calm and unreadable. She had a clinical air about her, detached yet focused. "Come in," Dr. Clarke said with a small smile, motioning for Clara to follow. "Let's talk about what's been happening to you." As Clara stepped into the office, the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in around her. Something about Dr. Clarke was unnerving, though Clara couldn't quite put her finger on it. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap, and for the first time felt a strange pull, a quiet, nagging sense that whatever was happening to her was only beginning. And that terrified her most of all. Chapter 2: The Unseen Hand. The following nights were worse. Each time Clara closed her eyes, sleep brought her not peace, but an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if her body no longer belonged to her, as if some invisible force seized control the moment she drifted into unconsciousness. She would awake in strange, even dangerous places, her breath ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. The first time it happened again, she found herself on the roof of her building, teetering on the edge. The wind whipped through her hair, the night sky vast and starless above her. She stared down at the street below, her mind blank for a moment as she tried to comprehend the scene before her. The realization hit like a cold wave. She was standing there, alone, in the middle of the night. But how? The door to the roof was always locked, yet here she was. Panic gripped her as she hurried back down the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. She barely remembered how she got to her apartment, but the image of that precipice, the yawning void beneath her feet, lingered like a dark shadow. The next night was worse. This time, Clara awoke in the middle of the woods, trees towering around her like silent sentinels. The branches above seemed to close in, their crooked fingers reaching for her as if they sought to pull her deeper into the darkness. The woods were unfamiliar, but they held an air of abandonment that sent shivers down her spine. She could hear the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and something else, something far less natural. Clara's feet were bare, her nightgown tattered from the branches she must have stumbled through. Her legs trembled, and her breath came in short gasps as she tried to make sense of the growing nightmare. A sick feeling twisted in her stomach. She had no idea how far she had wandered this time. Every direction looked the same, shrouded in shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Her pulse quickened as she began to hear faint whispers, just on the edge of her consciousness. They were distant at first, barely audible, but grew louder as if someone or something was close, speaking directly into her mind. The words were indistinct, garbled, and yet she felt their meaning seep into her bones, like commands she couldn't quite understand. She had to get away. By the time she stumbled out of the woods and found herself on the edge of town, the sun was just beginning to rise. Exhausted, Clara collapsed onto her knees, the weight of fear pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. How much longer could this go on? How much more could she endure before whatever was happening to her consumed her completely? At home, Sam's concern had grown to full-blown alarm. His eyes were heavy with sleeplessness, his expression marked by lines of worry. "Clara, this isn't normal. This is getting worse," he said one morning, after watching her stagger back in from another night of unexplained wandering. "I know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't understand any of it." In an attempt to help, Sam installed cameras around the house, desperate to capture what was happening while Clara slept. He set them up in the bedroom, in the hallway, even outside the front door, hoping the footage would provide some clue, something that could explain the terrifying episodes. The first night the cameras were up, they captured nothing out of the ordinary. Clara went to bed as usual, falling asleep within minutes. And yet, as always, she awoke somewhere she couldn't explain. This time, standing at the edge of a cliff, the ocean crashing against the rocks far below. She had no memory of leaving her bed or walking there. When she returned home, she and Sam reviewed the footage, hoping for some insight. What they saw chilled them both. The video showed Clara lying in bed, still and peaceful. But then slowly, she sat up, her movements deliberate and unsettlingly calm. She rose from the bed, her eyes wide open but vacant, as though she were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Without hesitation, she walked out of the room, down the hallway, and out the front door. There was no hesitation, no stumbling. Her steps were unnervingly purposeful, as if she was following a command only she could hear. Sam rewound the footage, watching again and again, but nothing changed. This isn't just sleepwalking, Clara," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "It's like you're being guided." Clara's blood ran cold. The word guided echoed in her mind, matching the whispers she had heard in the woods. What could it mean? Who or what was guiding her? And why? The next appointment with Dr. Clarke couldn't come fast enough. Clara sat in the psychologist's office, her hands trembling in her lap as she recounted the past few nights, each episode growing more bizarre, more dangerous. She mentioned the videos, the whispers, and the strange sense that she was being directed, controlled by an unseen hand. Dr. Clarke listened with an expression of calm curiosity, her fingers steepled under her chin. "Sleep disorders can sometimes present in very unusual ways," she said thoughtfully, though there was a distant edge to her voice. "It's possible your mind is manifesting something buried deep in your subconscious, perhaps repressed trauma or unacknowledged fears. Sleepwalking is often linked to unresolved psychological conflicts." Clara shook her head, her frustration mounting. "This doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like it's coming from me. It feels external, like something else is pulling the strings." Dr. Clarke raised an eyebrow. "External forces can often be misinterpreted by the brain as part of a dream state. The subconscious is very powerful, Clara. It can create entire worlds without you realizing it." Clara bit her lip, trying to process the explanation, but it didn't sit right. The dreams, no, they weren't just dreams, they were real. The places she had been, the danger she had felt, they were too vivid, too deliberate to be the product of her own mind. But how could she explain that to anyone without sounding insane? The nights continued, each one darker than the last. The dreams, if they could still be called dreams, grew more vivid. The shadowy figures that once lurked on the edges of her consciousness now appeared clearer, though still wrapped in a cloak of mystery. They never spoke directly, but their presence was undeniable, as if they were watching, waiting for her to understand something beyond her comprehension. She woke one night in a graveyard, the tombstones worn and ancient under her bare feet. The whispers were louder now, almost clear enough to understand, but they faded the moment she fully awoke. She stood frozen among the graves, her breath visible in the frigid air, a deep, bone-chilling sense of being watched creeping up her spine. By the time she made it home, the terror was more palpable than ever. Something was controlling her, and the deeper she delved into these nocturnal journeys, the less she felt like herself. The Clara who used to laugh with Sam, the Clara who loved her work and her life, was slipping away, replaced by someone or something else. Whatever force had taken hold of her wasn't just in her dreams anymore. It was bleeding into her waking life, and she feared that soon there would be no place left to hide. Chapter 3: The Puppet's Strings. The night air was damp and heavy, clinging to Clara's skin as she awoke, cold and trembling. The familiar sensation of being disoriented hit her like a wave, but this time it was far worse. She wasn't in bed, she wasn't even in her house. Instead, she found herself standing on the outskirts of a graveyard, her feet sinking into the wet, muddy earth beneath her. The scent of decay and moisture filled her nostrils, and her heart raced as the sight of moss-covered gravestones surrounded her, their inscriptions worn and unreadable. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared down at her hands. They were caked in dark mud, the grime clinging to her skin as though she had been digging. Her clothes were soaked through, heavy with moisture and dirt. This wasn't a dream. This was real. Panic set in as she turned on her heel, stumbling away from the graveyard and sprinting down the lonely road that led back toward her house. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing could explain why she had woken up in such a place. The pounding of her heart in her ears drowned out the stillness of the night, her feet slapping against the pavement as she ran faster, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the graveyard. The moment she burst through the front door, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The person staring back at her didn't look like the Clara she knew. Her hair was matted, tangled with leaves, her cheeks streaked with dirt. The mud on her hands and clothes was all too real, confirming that whatever had happened wasn't confined to the dream world. She hadn't just imagined it. She had physically been there. The next morning, Sam was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot from the lack of sleep. He glanced up as Clara entered the room, his expression shifting from worry to disbelief when he noticed the mud-stained clothes she wore. "Clara, what happened?" Sam asked, his voice a mix of confusion and frustration. She hesitated, biting her lip, unsure of how to explain the inexplicable. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "I woke up at a graveyard." His brow furrowed. "You've been sleepwalking again?" Clara nodded, but her gaze was distant. "It's more than that. It's like the lines between my dreams and reality are starting to blur. The places I visit in my sleep, they're real. I'm really there, Sam." Sam let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "Clara, you know I'm trying to be supportive, but this is getting out of hand. Maybe Dr. Clarke was right. Maybe this is all psychological." "No," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's not just in my head, Sam. I was there. The mud, the dirt. Look at me. How do you explain that?" His skepticism was evident in the way his eyes hardened. "Clara, I don't know what to say anymore. You're not yourself. This can't keep going on like this." His words stung, the doubt clear in his tone, and she could feel the distance growing between them. Sam wanted to help, but his patience was wearing thin, and Clara could sense his belief in her slipping away. The more she tried to explain, the more isolated she became. His logical mind couldn't grasp the horror of what she was experiencing, leaving her to bear the weight of it alone. Clara's mind was a whirlwind as she showered off the grime and sat down in front of her laptop. She knew that there had to be something, anything, that could explain why these particular places kept drawing her. The graveyard, the forest, the cliff's edge, it couldn't be a coincidence. There had to be a connection, something tying these locations together. She began researching the town's history, delving into archives and old newspapers, hoping to find some clue that could offer insight. Hours passed, and as she combed through article after article, something caught her eye, a small blurb in the town's historical records. The graveyard she had found herself in was not just any burial site. Decades ago, it had been a focal point for strange occurrences, whispered rumors of occult practices and rituals that were said to have taken place there long before the town had grown into its current size. Her pulse quickened as she found more information, mentions of unsolved disappearances from the 1950s, strange symbols etched into stone, even accounts of locals reporting eerie voices in the woods at night. As she read on, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Each of the places Clara had been visiting in her sleepwalking episodes had some sort of connection to these ancient, unsolved mysteries. It wasn't just sleepwalking. She was being led to these places for a reason. That night, as Clara lay in bed, her mind raced with the newfound knowledge. She didn't dare tell Sam. His growing disbelief only pushed her further away, and she feared if she shared this with him, he would dismiss it entirely, or worse, think she was losing her grip on reality. The tension between them had already reached a breaking point, and Clara wasn't sure their relationship could survive much more strain. He had once been her anchor, the one person she could turn to in moments of uncertainty, but now she felt like she was drifting further from him with each passing day. The rift widened when Sam suggested she stop researching altogether. "Clara, I think you're getting too wrapped up in this. It's feeding your anxiety. Let's just focus on Dr. Clarke's treatment, okay?" Clara's heart sank. "You don't believe me, do you?" "Of course I do," Sam said, but his hesitation was telling. "I just think maybe this research is making things worse." She didn't argue, but inside, her resolve only strengthened. She couldn't stop now, not when she was getting closer to uncovering the truth. Clara found herself confiding in Emily, her old friend, one afternoon over coffee. Emily had always been more open-minded than Sam, someone who saw the world in shades of gray rather than strict black and white. As Clara explained everything, the sleepwalking, the mud, the graveyard, and the eerie history she had uncovered, Emily listened intently, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I don't think this is something that modern medicine can explain," Emily said quietly after a long pause. "It sounds otherworldly." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Otherworldly?" Emily nodded. "There's so much out there that we don't understand, Clara. Strange things happen all the time, things that can't be explained by science alone. Have you ever considered that what's happening to you might not be psychological? Maybe it's something supernatural?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had considered the possibility in the darkest corners of her mind, but had been too afraid to say it out loud. Yet hearing Emily give voice to her suspicions made them feel more real, more plausible. "What are you suggesting?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There are ways to protect yourself from forces you can't see. There are people who deal with these things, people who know how to break the connection between this world and whatever else might be influencing you." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You think I need to see a paranormal expert?" "It might be worth considering," Emily said softly. "What you're dealing with, it sounds like it's beyond anything a psychologist can help with." Clara sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Could it really be something supernatural? And if so, how far was she willing to go to find the answers? Chapter 4: Whispers from the Past. Clara's research had become her lifeline. Each piece of information felt like a fragment of a larger puzzle, one she desperately needed to solve before she lost herself entirely. The town's past, once forgotten and buried, was slowly revealing its dark underbelly, and Clara knew she was getting closer to uncovering something dangerous, something that had been hidden for too long. She sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop casting a dim light across her face. Old newspaper clippings were strewn across the table, detailing disappearances from decades ago, each one eerily similar to her own experiences. Women just like her had been haunted by vivid dreams, reported to have wandered in their sleep to strange and unsettling places. The final, chilling detail in each case was the same. They had all vanished without a trace. The deeper Clara dug, the more she realized that the places she had been drawn to in her sleep were not random. The cliff, the forest, the graveyard, each had a connection to one of these missing women. The stories were scattered across time, spanning years, but the pattern was undeniable. These women had been pulled into something sinister, something that hadn't let them go. But the most unsettling discovery of all was that each of these cases had been quietly handled by a single individual. Dr. Elizabeth Clarke. Clara stared at the name, her mind racing. It couldn't be a coincidence. Dr. Clarke had been practicing in the town for years, far longer than Clara had realized. But what did that mean? How could her therapist, a woman she had trusted, be involved in this? The next time Clara visited Dr. Clarke's office, her unease was palpable. She sat stiffly in the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling the weight of suspicion pressing down on her chest. Dr. Clarke, as always, was composed, her face calm and unreadable, the faint smile she wore never reaching her eyes. Clara hesitated before speaking, but the questions she had been holding back for days finally spilled out. "Dr. Clarke, have you ever heard of the disappearances in this town? The women who went missing decades ago?" Dr. Clarke's expression remained unchanged, but Clara noticed a subtle shift in the air, as though the temperature in the room had dropped by several degrees. "Disappearances?" she echoed, her tone measured. "This town has a long history, Clara. It's not unusual for there to be rumors and stories that people cling to. Small towns thrive on their mysteries." Clara's heart raced. There was something off about the way Dr. Clarke dismissed her concerns. These women, they had the same symptoms as me. They were sleepwalking, having nightmares. They were drawn to the same places I've been going, and they all disappeared. Dr. Clarke's smile faded slightly, her gaze sharpening. "Clara, I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. The mind can play tricks when it's under stress, and we've talked about the importance of staying grounded. You're experiencing a lot of anxiety right now." "No," Clara interrupted, her voice firmer than she intended. "It's not just stress. I found records. I found your name." Dr. Clarke's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked. The warmth that had once been a staple of their sessions had evaporated, leaving behind a chill that set Clara's nerves on edge. "My name?" Dr. Clarke's voice was icier now. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Clara?" The words stuck in Clara's throat. What was she accusing Dr. Clarke of? Being complicit in these women's disappearances? Knowing more than she was letting on? The doubts that had been gnawing at Clara were suddenly tangible, but she wasn't ready to voice them. Not yet. She needed more proof. I just want to understand," Clara muttered, her resolve faltering under Dr. Clarke's intense gaze. Dr. Clarke leaned forward slightly, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Clara, it's important to focus on your treatment. Chasing after conspiracy theories will only make things worse for you. Trust me, I'm here to help." But Clara didn't trust her, not anymore. That night, Clara's sleep was plagued by the same unrelenting nightmares, but now they had grown more vivid, more oppressive. A figure loomed in the darkness, always just beyond her reach, watching her with unseen eyes. The sensation of being controlled, of having her movements dictated by some unseen force, had become overwhelming. She wasn't just wandering aimlessly. Something was leading her. The dream shifted, and Clara found herself standing at the edge of a dark, still lake, the water's surface rippling softly as though disturbed by something beneath. She couldn't move, her body frozen in place as the figure drew closer, whispering words she couldn't understand. Cold hands wrapped around her wrists, pulling her toward the water, urging her forward. And then, just as the water lapped at her toes, she jolted awake, gasping for breath. Her heart thundered in her chest, her body drenched in sweat, but something was wrong. Her feet were wet. She blinked in confusion, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The sheets around her were damp, and her legs were covered in mud. Panic set in as she scrambled out of bed, her eyes darting to the window. It was open, the cool night air seeping in, and beyond it she could see the faint outline of the lake in the distance. She had been there. Again. The following morning, Clara sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the table. Sam had already left for work, his absence a stark reminder of the growing distance between them. He had barely spoken to her since their last argument, and Clara couldn't blame him. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, and with each passing day, her isolation deepened. Desperation gnawed at her as she picked up her phone and dialed Emily's number. Within minutes, Emily arrived, her face filled with concern as she sat down across from Clara. "I don't know what's happening to me," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "It's getting worse, Emily. I almost walked into the lake last night. I wasn't awake. I was dreaming, but I was really there." Emily frowned, her expression serious. "You need to stop seeing Dr. Clarke." Clara looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I've been doing some research of my own," Emily continued, her voice low. "Dr. Clarke's name comes up in a lot of strange places. There are rumors, people who've gone to her for treatment and never been the same. I'm starting to think she knows more about what's happening to you than she's letting on." A chill ran down Clara's spine. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from Emily only solidified her fears. "You think she's involved in all of this?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, her brow furrowing. "But there's something off about her. I don't think she's just a therapist. There's a lot about her past that doesn't add up." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. If Dr. Clarke was connected to the disappearances, then what was her endgame? And why was Clara being targeted? "I don't know who to trust anymore," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. Emily reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "We'll figure this out, Clara. You're not alone in this." But despite Emily's words, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was alone, that no one could truly understand the darkness creeping into her life. And as the whispers from her dreams grew louder, more insistent, Clara knew that time was running out. The puppet strings were tightening, and she was being pulled toward something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 5. The Nightwalker's Curse. Clara's pursuit of answers had led her into the dark recesses of the town's forgotten lore. But what she uncovered next was far more sinister than she had ever imagined. Her recent discoveries had left her shaken, and the lines between her waking life and her nightmares were blurring beyond recognition. The breakthrough came one dreary afternoon while Clara was sifting through old local records and folklore. She stumbled upon a collection of documents hidden in a dusty corner of the library's archives, documents that detailed ancient rituals and curses tied to the town's history. Her eyes widened as she read through accounts of ceremonies performed under the cover of darkness, designed to summon and bind spirits to the living. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. These rituals were conducted to control certain individuals, mostly women, and the pattern was eerily similar to what Clara had been experiencing. The spirits summoned were meant to manipulate and possess, using the cursed individuals as pawns to fulfill their dark purposes. It was then that Clara realized the horrifying truth. Her sleepwalking wasn't merely a medical anomaly. It was a curse, a remnant of these ancient rites. Desperate for confirmation, Clara dug deeper into the town's archives, cross-referencing her findings with personal accounts and unsolved mysteries. The more she read, the more she understood that the spirit controlling her was not just any entity, but the very same one responsible for the disappearances decades ago. The same spirit that had haunted the lives of other women before her. But what of Dr. Elizabeth Clarke? Clara's suspicions about her had been growing ever since her disturbing discoveries about the disappearances. Determined to uncover the full extent of Dr. Clarke's involvement, Clara conducted her own investigation into the psychologist's past. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Dr. Clarke's name appeared frequently in records related to the town's occult history. Clara learned that Dr. Clarke had been researching the curse for years, using her patients as unwitting participants in her experiments. The psychologist had studied the phenomena closely, trying to unlock the power behind the curse by observing its effects on those afflicted. Clara's own condition had been a part of these experiments, a chance for Dr. Clarke to understand and harness the curse's true potential. Clara's heart pounded as she prepared for the inevitable confrontation. She had to face Dr. Clarke, to confront her about the manipulations and the torment she had endured. The encounter was inevitable, and Clara braced herself for the truth she feared. The office was eerily quiet when Clara entered. Dr. Clarke sat behind her desk, her demeanor calm and collected, as if she were unaware of the storm that was about to break. Clara's footsteps echoed in the room as she approached, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Dr. Clarke," Clara began, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I know what's really going on. I've uncovered the curse, the ancient rituals that are controlling me. You've been part of this all along, haven't you?" Dr. Clarke's expression remained unchanged, though there was a glint of something in her eyes, an emotion Clara couldn't quite place. "Clara, I understand you're feeling distressed, but you need to calm down. The curse you're referring to is a myth. It's been debunked countless times." Clara shook her head vehemently. "It's not a myth. I've seen the records. I know about the rituals and the spirits, and I know you've been using me as part of your experiments. Why? What do you want from me?" Dr. Clarke's calm facade cracked slightly, revealing a hint of frustration. "You've been misled, Clara. What you're experiencing is a result of your own fears and anxieties, amplified by your sleepwalking. I've studied this for years, but it's not what you think. The curse is not as straightforward as you believe." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you involve me? Why did you let this continue?" Dr. Clarke's gaze grew cold. "You misunderstand. Your sleepwalking was triggered by something you unleashed long before you ever came to me. The spirit controlling you wasn't placed there by me. It was a part of something that has been part of your life for years. A consequence of something you did." Clara recoiled in shock. "What are you talking about? I don't remember anything that could have caused this." Dr. Clarke leaned forward, her tone softer, but no less intense. "You released the spirit unknowingly. It was bound to you by a mistake or choice you made in your past. My role was to study its effects, not to create them." Clara felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Her entire world had been upended. and the person she had trusted was now her greatest adversary. So what now? What do I do? Dr. Clarke's eyes softened, but her expression remained guarded. To truly break free from this curse, you must confront the spirit directly. You need to understand what you released and how to undo it. I can guide you, but the choice to confront it is yours alone. As Clara left Dr. Clarke's office, her mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. The weight of her revelations pressed down on her, making her feel as though she were drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. She had been manipulated, her torment used as a tool for someone else's research. But now she had a path forward, a path that led to confronting the very force that had controlled her life. Clara knew that the next step was crucial. To break the curse, she had to delve into her past, uncovering the roots of the spirit's influence. The task ahead was daunting, fraught with uncertainty, but Clara was determined. She had to reclaim her life, confront the darkness that had haunted her, and uncover the truth behind the curse. With newfound resolve, Clara set out to piece together the fragments of her past, knowing that the answers she sought were intertwined with the very spirit that had controlled her. The journey ahead would be perilous, but she was ready to face whatever lay in wait. The Nightwalker's curse was not the end. It was just the beginning of her fight for freedom and truth. Chapter 6. Into the Dark. The weight of Clara's new understanding pressed heavily upon her. Her past was a labyrinth of shadows, and the path to liberation was obscured by a veil of uncertainty. Determined to free herself from the clutches of the curse, Clara knew she had to confront the source of her torment, the very place where the original ritual had taken place. The location was buried deep within the town's forgotten history, hidden in the overgrown woods on the outskirts. Clara's investigation had revealed fragments of old maps and accounts of the ritual's site, but the journey to uncover it was fraught with challenges. Every step she took seemed to echo with the failures of those who had come before her, each attempt to break the curse having ended in despair. As Clara ventured further into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the very air was saturated with the remnants of past rituals. Her flashlight flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The night was thick with a palpable tension, and the forest seemed alive with whispers of long-forgotten incantations. Clara's resolve hardened with each passing moment. The stakes were high. Her sanity and possibly her life hung in the balance. In a secluded glade, Clara stumbled upon the remnants of the old ritual site. Stones arranged in a circular pattern, worn and weathered by time, formed an unsettling altar. The symbols etched into the stones matched those she had seen in the ancient records. The ritual's dark purpose had left its mark on this place, and the oppressive energy was almost tangible. With trembling hands, Clara examined the stones, her mind racing with the weight of what she had learned. The evidence she found, rusted implements, remnants of old offerings, spoke of a dark legacy that had ensnared many before her. The sense of foreboding grew as she realized she was walking in the footsteps of those who had failed to escape the curse. As Clara prepared to conduct her own ritual to break the curse, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The atmosphere crackled with an otherworldly energy, and a chilling breeze swept through the glade. From the shadows emerged the spirit that had plagued her, its form a shifting, nebulous presence. Clara's heart raced as the apparition took shape, its gaze fixated on her with an intensity that pierced through her very soul. The spirit's voice echoed through the clearing, a haunting whisper that resonated with ancient power. "You seek to undo what cannot be undone, Clara. The curse is woven into the fabric of your being. Surrender now, and join those who came before you." Clara's eyes darted around the clearing, seeking a way to counter the spirit's malevolent influence. She knew that her only chance of breaking free was to confront the spirit directly and sever the connection between it and her own soul. Gathering her courage, she began to recite the incantations she had learned, each word heavy with the weight of hope and desperation. The ritual intensified, the air thick with crackling energy. The spirit's form wavered, as though the incantations were having an effect. Clara's voice grew stronger, determined to break the bond that had held her captive for so long. The spirit's whispers grew frantic, the energy in the clearing surging to a fever pitch. As the ritual reached its climax, Clara faced the ultimate choice. The spirit's voice grew pleading, its demeanor shifting from malevolent to desperate. "You cannot escape me. Embrace your fate, or you will lose everything." Clara hesitated for a moment, the weight of her decision almost too much to bear. But then, with a final surge of strength, she completed the incantation, channeling every ounce of her willpower into the act. The spirit's form flickered violently, its anguished wails piercing the night as the energy in the clearing dissipated. For a moment, the air was still. Clara stood alone in the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of eerie calm. She had done it. She had broken the curse. The journey back to her home was a blur. Clara felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion as she arrived, her mind struggling to reconcile the events of the night. Sam greeted her with a mixture of concern and hope, eager to see her safe. Clara embraced him, the warmth of his presence a stark contrast to the cold terror she had endured. The following days were a whirlwind of normalcy as Clara and Sam tried to rebuild their lives. The nightmares seemed to have faded, and Clara cautiously began to believe that she had truly escaped the curse. Yet a lingering unease shadowed her every step, a gnawing doubt that refused to be silenced. One night, as Clara and Sam prepared for bed, Clara's mind was restless, replaying the events of the past weeks. She lay down beside Sam, her thoughts drifting to the ritual and the spirit she had confronted. Sleep came slowly, her dreams teetering on the edge of darkness. Suddenly, Clara jolted awake. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room. The familiar surroundings of her bedroom felt foreign and unsettling. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of her dream. As she glanced out the window, her blood ran cold. The moonlight illuminated a familiar scene. The edge of the cliff from the ritual site, standing stark against the night sky. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized that she was no longer in her bed, but standing on the precipice she had fought so hard to escape. The chilling realization settled over her like a shroud. Had she truly broken free from the curse, or had the spirit's grip tightened more than ever before? The boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred once more, leaving Clara with a harrowing question. Was she still trapped in the curse's grasp, or had she merely awakened to a new, more insidious form of torment? As the wind howled around her, Clara's fate remained uncertain. The final scene was a stark reminder of the darkness that lingered just beyond the edge of the known world. A reminder that some curses are never truly broken, but only masked by the thin veneer of hope. The story closed with Clara standing at the cliff's edge, the moonlight casting long shadows as she faced the abyss, uncertain of what lay beyond. The haunting ambiguity of her fate left readers with a chilling sense of unease, a reminder that the darkness of the mind can often be more daunting than the shadows of reality.